Benchmark, the voice of business. Presented by LMD.
On this edition of Benchmark, looking ahead to a fresh start in this new year, we assess the priorities for the nation with Maninda Wickramasinghe, the Managing Director, CEO and Country Head of Fitch Ratings Lanka. The LMD Nielsen Business Confidence Index registered a 4-year high in December. More on this from Terika Miyanadeniya, Nielsen's Director of Consumer Insights. And wrapping up this edition of Benchmark, LMD's columnist Shiran Fernando discusses the global economy as well as Sri Lanka's export sector. That's the lineup for Benchmark.
A happy new year to you. Welcome to the very first edition of Benchmark for 2020. I am Savitri Rodrigo. So what would the third decade of the 21st century hold for Sri Lanka? Much depends on the government's policies, the policies that are needed to ensure sustainable growth, and also not to mention the measures that are needed for national reconciliation. So to get a pulse of the nation, we have our very first guest today with us on Benchmark, Maninda Wickramasinghe, the Managing Director, CEO and Country Head of Fitch Ratings Lanka. Happy New Year to you, Maninda, and welcome to Benchmark. Thank you for joining us today. What are your expectations for Sri Lanka this year?
Well, I don't think there is much more in terms of what we've seen through the year. There's been a slowdown in growth, a slowdown in credit, and I don't see any of that coming off. Although a new president has announced a stimulus package or part of a stimulus package, I don't think that's going to do any reversal for this year. So this year we are going to see a kind of one of the lowest growth rates probably in a long time. So we need to clearly understand that this is the opportunity for Asia and we need to be part of that system. So I cannot see any bright spot other than one important sector is tourism, and tourism has probably made a pretty good recovery by our standards. I think the efforts of damage control, some positive messaging going out, social media, all of this has contributed to some sort of a restoration of normalcy for tourism.
So in your view, what are the priorities that the government should have in the coming year?
You have to set a growth trajectory and a sustainable one. So in doing so, it cannot be all over. So Sri Lanka has some inherent competitive advantages. So you need to identify, you prioritize them and set up mechanisms of building the entire competitive advantage strategically. It's easy for someone to say, for example, tourism is a competitive advantage, but you have to be strategic about the kind of tourism you want. So you need to have a plan. We don't need to go and reinvent the wheel. I believe there have been lots of plans done. So one of the flaws in Sri Lanka is that very often when regimes change, plans change. So some of the good things that may have happened get undone, and there is a whole rethinking. But I think it's important that we need to make it a sustainable long term. There have to be building blocks, achievable, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, it doesn't matter, but they need to be set up that way, and I think move in that direction. I use tourism as an example, but to me education would be another low-hanging fruit to set in place, and there is a whole lot of work that has to be done there. Don't forget, if we are to achieve technology savvy, capable professionals, If you start from year one, it takes you a good 15 years to get that person out into the market. So we need to think like that. I think clearly it's important that we need to look at existing products and services that we have, if I may call it, I mean sectors of the economy that can be quickly put into a positive growth trajectory, and then some that might take longer. So you need to identify, and a couple of them would be existing exports where we can add more value, bring the technology in, add value, get it out to market, find new markets, encourage people. I think there is absolutely no question about it. If you need to incentivize people, use everything needed, because it's important that we get this growth momentum going. Its growth momentum has been on a decline.
Speaking of growth momentum, the government's new national policy framework objectives puts our growth at 6.5% or maybe even higher, and also exceeding a per capita income of $6,500, which will range from 2020 to 2025. Fitch Ratings, on that note, says that achieving ambitious growth targets could entail stimulus measures that erode fiscal headroom, which is limited by high public debt. So, if that is the case, what policies are needed to ensure sustainable growth?
We have to understand that there is not much headroom particularly for capital expenditure in a government's budget program. Very often they budget for capex and then actually have to do away with it. So that's important in terms of setting the growth momentum, because don't forget, we are probably 25 to 30 years behind the region in infrastructure expense. And so we have to find mechanisms, and that's not too difficult. So importantly is that the mechanisms are, how do you include private capital inflows, whether it comes from joint ventures or from foreign investors who make direct investments. You need to channel them into these projects that you are doing. In the meantime, it's very clear that part of the fiscal problem comes from big government. So that's not an option now. It's very clear, and I think as a new government, one of the targets they've set is an SOE reform program, so that you don't let's say pump capital into non-performing assets. You need to look at that as a whole. How do we rationalize? We should probably be able to do away with some of the assets that don't perform. We need to be able to resource the performing assets. So this would be a reallocation. All of this would definitely be will help a more sustainable model. Sri Lanka has to set itself some goals in terms of collecting tax revenue. Our tax compliance is one of the lowest. From what I understand, between 13 to 15%. So if there are 100 taxpayers, only 15 pay. Now there is that kind of room. That has to come from tax administration, efficiencies, use all your IT infrastructure, and it can be done. So on one side you have your SOE reforms, on the other side you have better tax collection, and then mechanisms of how to attract capital where government's contribution is nominal, and we need to prioritize what are those assets that they want to improve.
President Gotabaya Rajapaksa stated that development is the key to taking forward the reconciliation process with the minorities. This includes, of course, infrastructure development, generation of jobs, and also the improvement of general as well as vocational training and education. What measures are needed to ensure holistic national reconciliation?
To begin with, I'm probably not competent to, talk about how does one do reconciliation. It is definitely required, and when you have protracted conflict, there are injured parties on all sides. So you have to understand that you cannot just simply say, oh, we just go back to the old status quo. But I have traveled to the north maybe 4 times since 2009. I have seen infrastructure being built, roads, cable, electricity cabling, telephone connections, fiber optic cable laying, all of that has been done, restoration of buildings, all of that. But the key thing in that area is, where do I get my job? Where do the youth who go to school there, and they have excellent schooling there, some of the oldest missionary schools and established schools are in that part of the country. So where do these young people find employment? And it makes sense to seriously look at that part as potentially where we need to set up economic activity that would benefit the youth in that part of the country. And clearly there is a large pool of resource. So you have to give them skill sets, and post your advanced level or your level, sure, you need to have your vocational skills, all of that. You need to orient your degree programs to be able to cater to a market that would be set up possibly in terms of investments, private sector capital moving there. Again, private sector capital might have to be incentivized to move there. I see potentially IT related businesses could probably set up. I believe already there have been some initiatives on that. But again, don't forget that anyone who now is in junior school will not have any idea of what went on say 15 years ago. So it is important that we get that person's mindset right. I think we need to create jobs, give hope to that youth, because like I said, they don't have a recollection of what went on, and they are looking, saying they want to know what's lying in future for me.
So let's get back to what the new year is looking like, Maninda, after this commercial break. On the other side, we ask Maninda Wickramasinghe to rate Sri Lanka's efforts when it comes to building climate resilience, and also whether there is adequate focus on important areas in terms of developing the country's infrastructure. Stay with us.
We are a Sri Lankan bank. This is our home. That's why we are committed towards the future of this country, funding national development initiatives, because we believe in banking beyond transactions. HNB, your partner in progress.
So we're taking a look at what 2020 might be on Benchmark today, and we're resuming our discussion with Maninda Wickramasinghe, who's the Managing Director, CEO and Country Head of Fitch Ratings Lanka. Maninda, when you look at 2020 and also what's been happening in the past, what are the key concerns when it comes to law and order?
Well, laws must apply equally to everyone, and I also think that we have some archaic laws. I mean, I'm not a legal expert, but for example, I'm just taking a case in point. We had a law where women are prohibited of buying liquor or something like that. I'm not sure whether I'm interpreting it right, but if that kind of thing happened, if you are going, forward thinking, you're talking of women being in the workforce, contributing to the economy, well, the law must equally apply. So I mean, that's how modern worlds operate. You can't be disadvantaged because of some archaic law. So there may be lots more like that. We need to really start doing that. We could probably look at either looking at you can either tinker with existing laws, modifying them, or come up with a whole new set of rules, and be progressive. You don't want laws to be prohibitive.
India recently announced a $400 million line of credit to Sri Lanka, and also Japan reaffirmed their commitment to cooperating in areas such as ICT and port infrastructure development. Do you believe there is adequate focus on important areas in terms of developing the country's infrastructure?
I think Sri Lanka, as I mentioned, needs to realize that infrastructure gives you certain efficiencies. But I think one of the problems we have is every piece of infrastructure or assets we create, we want to have ownership. Now, you don't need to own all of it, right? Don't forget, if you're using your own capital, certainly yes, you own it, no problem. But Sri Lanka does not have that luxury. So, if you want foreign capital, you have to give them something. And that can be in a form of a long-term cash flow. There are plenty of tested models. Example, I'll take the case of the South Harbour extension. So the government took a loan and built the South Harbour extension. But the terminals are on PPPs. So that's a way where the country can participate in some form of equity, but you bring the capital in, bring the technology in, and the operational efficiencies through an investment. So I think that's an excellent model to understand. You have to prioritize. What do you want? Do you want ownership, or do you want these assets to work for something bigger? What is that something bigger? That sustainable growth that we are talking of. That comes because infrastructure is absolutely necessary. So, I'll give you a classic example. If you land in Katunayaka and you want to go to a hotel in the East Coast, and you have an amazing area that has been developed with a plethora of hotels, it takes you all about 7 hours to get there. Do we have, or have we thought about a domestic airport next to the international airport? You get off and you get on to a domestic flight and you go to your destination. It's probably an hour maximum. So this kind of thinking has to happen. That's infrastructure, and we do not need to own that.
So looking at the world at this point, we're seeing ongoing discussions about Brexit. We're seeing anti-government demonstrations continuing in Hong Kong, and also the WTO downgrading the trade forecast for the world from 3% to 2.7%, just a few areas that are being highlighted at the moment. What is your assessment of the state of the world?
We are living on thin ice as a global economy because we've, since 2008, where there was a global economic disaster virtually happening, we found a mechanism of how to contain it. That's not a bad thing, but I think it also meant that letting it go has become a problem. So you saw, for example, Federal Reserve talking of quantitative easing and then pull back from the whole program because they knew there would be other implications. So European Union has gone the same route in terms of printing money to bolster the EU region. Now, how do you smartly untangle yourself from this? So while this is not to say it's doomsday, but we are really sort of, there are countries, even Germany, showing signs of early, probably signals of a recession. Now, if some of that was to set in, well, you cannot, what are the big economies that can sustain a growth model. So that's why growth forecasts are being lowered and caution being applied. But, well, it still takes some hard decisions, and it's very clear that decision isn't going to come from the US. You see the realignment of the US economy. They are definitely looking at inwardly, looking at what kind of job creation you're trying to bring back industry and investment into the US away from, say, China, for example. I mean, part of this whole trade deal or trade dispute with China is about that. So while you go looking inwardly and whether that can be sustained, because we all believed in this global model. Now, if that's going out and everybody starts looking inwardly, in fact, amazingly, the country that's championing globalization now seems to be China. It's going to hurt some economies for sure. And so the global slowdown is probably going to continue. And if China is the supplier to the globe, well, if there is no consumption, well, then Chinese growth rates also will start slowing down.
So Maninda, where do you expect Sri Lanka to be at the end of 2020?
I would like to think that, we talk of, even in the most difficult period of the 25 years, of 30 years of protracted war going on, we've had 4.5% growth. So I think that's achievable. And I guess where if the right policies and the right strategic thinking goes in, I can't see why we cannot get back to a growth trajectory. Clearly, we need to also identify new areas of growth and how to set it up. So I think 2020 we can't expect quick wins or quick results, but if we get the trajectory right, example, tourism can be a big growth sector if the weather holds. For example, you might have a better agriculture recovery. Having said that, the way we do agriculture, we need to rethink. How do we modernize our agriculture and the way we do that? So there is a lot of room there, and that is your existing farm you're talking of. So how do we make them more productive? These are probably some planning, some strategic thinking can set those wheels in motion. So I am more positive for 2020.
So here's to a great new year, Maninda. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
We've been looking at the new year with Maninda Wickramasinghe, the Managing Director, CEO and Country Head of Fitch Ratings Lanka. And as we move to the other side with Anushan Silvaraja, wishing you love, peace and joy in 2020.
LMD is making waves, airwaves. The next big thing from Sri Lanka's pioneering business journal, LMD Podcast, now online. Listen to our articles on the go at www.lmd.lk. Select, play, listen. It's that simple.
We are a Sri Lankan bank. This is our home. That's why we are committed towards the future of this country, funding national development initiatives, because we believe in banking beyond transactions. HNB, your partner in progress.
Welcome back to Benchmark. I'm Maninda Wickramasinghe. Now for a closer look at the latest on the LMD Nielsen Business Confidence Index. Joining me is the Director of Consumer Insights from Nielsen, Terika Mianadiniya. Welcome back to the show, Terika. Now, to start off with, how has the BCI performed?
It's good news all the way. There has been a phenomenal jump in both the BCI and the CCI, which is recording an all-time high in 5 years. The BCI now stands at 185 from 101 last month. which is a jump of about 74 points. And the CCI is a record 71 from last month's 53. So I guess these unprecedented increases have come in the wake of the new president take over the reins in Sri Lanka and some of the policies he has so far put in place.
So how do respondents view our economy doing in the short and the long term?
So not only the BC and the CCI, all the other indicators have also shot up. The percentage of leaders saying that the economy will improve in the coming 12 months have increased from 32% in November to 74% in December. A phenomenal increase of about 42%. Not only that, there is optimism among business leaders in the state of their business improving in the next year, as 79% of business leaders as opposed to 43 last month reflected the state of improvement for the coming year. So the same sentiments were reflected for the short term as well, whereas 2/3 of the business leaders feel that their businesses are going to improve as opposed to about 1/3 last month.
What about the investment climate then, Terika?
So the current investment climate in the country has also improved. So 42% of business leaders feel that it is a good time to invest in the country. Last month it was only about 7%. So therefore you see that people are now business leaders are now beginning to now wake up and start investing in their businesses.
Now with everything shooting up, as you said, Terika, what will be the main issues both on the national and business front?
So high taxes continue to be high on the agenda as one of the most pressing issues in Sri Lanka, followed by inflation. Now the percentage of business leaders voicing out about political environment has now gone down to 47% as compared to 63 last time. So therefore that has settled down a little bit more. The economy has come up as the topmost of the three most pressing issues today, followed by the political culture. And also bribery and corruption has also emerged as a top pressing issue nationwide.
So then what would be your projections?
So the next few months as we approach the general elections will determine the course of both the BC and the CCI. For the time being, both the business community and the consumers are riding on the euphoria of the aftermath of the elections, and it would be interesting to see how both these indices will fare as time goes on. But for the time being, I believe that the indices will continue to rise. Maybe not as phenomenally as was last month, but I believe it will continue to rise.
Thank you very much for joining us, Terika.
Thank you.
That was Director of Consumer Insights from Nielsen, Terika Maninda. We'll be right back after a short commercial break. Stay tuned.
We are a Sri Lankan bank. This is our home. That's why we are committed towards the future of this country, funding national development initiatives, because we believe in banking beyond transactions. HNB, your partner in progress.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Anushan Selvaraja. Now for a closer look at the latest on the economy. Joining me is economist and LMD columnist Shiran Fernando. Welcome back to the show, Shiran. Now, new year, new troubles. How do you see the global economy performing this year?
So we've had a really rollicking start, if I was to put, to the global economy in 2020 with what's gone on with US-Iran tensions. So far, markets have not priced too much of risk, even though we've seen volatility in oil in particular, which is very important for Sri Lanka. And we've also seen a rise in gold, which tends to happen when investors assess a risky situation. But I think going forward, this is something that not only is US-Iran involved, but also beyond that to the Middle East, and what that means for oil in particular from a Sri Lankan perspective. So we need to, I think, global economy really now will come into more focus, in particular when Sri Lanka has to go out and go into international markets. They have to time those kind of entries correctly.
Now let's take our exports, Shiran. How have they performed, and how do you expect them to perform this year?
So what we saw in terms of a trend was in the first half of 2019, we saw exports sort of going at the same pace that it did in 2018. But in particular, in the second half, we've seen a bit of a contraction in terms of the export momentum. We are seeing no growth as such, just a bit of a stagnation there. and it's also, I think, a reflection of some of our key demand markets. So if you look at EU and America, the talks of a slowdown, trade slowdown, as well as overall growth slowdown is now having a trickle down effect to markets like Sri Lanka. So I think that will be a key thing going forward.
Now new leadership and all in the country. So what is your take on the policy measures that have been implemented so far?
What we've seen since November 16th is more things done on the tax side of it, and a stimulus package introduced, really to get growth back up. We still don't know the total impact of it because this was only the last month and a half of 2019, and so far we've just had a few days in 2020. So I think it will definitely have kind of a consumption boost. But I think what we need to now see signs is more towards how things will be shaped towards investment. What are some of the new policies looking towards that? Because tax changes are more short-term things, just to revive and get more optimism going. But what will really sustain it? I think it will be these key reforms that we need more clarity on. And I think some of the statements and the policy document by the President, I think, will definitely show signs of that as the year goes on.
Thank you very much for joining us, Shiran.
Thank you.
That was economist and LMD columnist Shiran Fernando. Thank you for watching Benchmark, and we hope to see you again next time.